Good afternoon, fellow classmates, and welcome to our panel discussion intended to inform and educate you on the tipping culture in America, as well as the possible alternatives to it. My name is Sina Mogadasi, and a little bit of background on myself. I've worked bottom up in the service industry, starting as a busboy to a server, to a service assistant, to a waiter. So I have a balanced view on the topic, and I'll be directing the flow of discussion between our panelists. Our panelists being Charles Reneker, the owner and proprietor of the Alinea Restaurant Group in Chicago, and he'll kind of give a corporate and management perspective on the issue. Next is Brianna Moore, who is a current worker in the industry, and she will be directly affected by any changes made in the tipping culture. And finally, Nico Escalante, who has worked in big franchises across the nation, who would be impacted most by these things, such as Bangers, Fuddruckers, and many more. And with that said, I'd like to establish some ground rules about the discussion. There will be 3 questions. Each panelist will have a chance to reply to these questions. 80 seconds will be allotted to them. And after that, there will be a brief Q&A session. I ask that you hold any questions or remarks till the end. As well as, if you can, please turn off all electronic devices and anything else that would distract or make noise. That being said, Charles, I'd like to start with you. From your personal experience, why do you like or not like tips?
Thank you. So my name is Charles Reneker. I'm the owner and proprietor of the Alinea Restaurant Group in Chicago, and I'm opposed to tips. Why? Because they're inconsistent, they're ineffective, and they're just straight tacky. They're inconsistent for the servers. You have no idea how someone's going to tip one night or another. And it's also actually more work for the manager, because if someone doesn't get the wages they deserve, minimum wage, then they have to do more work and pay them that money, which is just an extra burden at the end of a long shift. Not only that, but tipping is paid after the service is provided, and so there's no obligation that someone will tip. They have to pay for the meal, but they don't have to tip even 1% if they don't want to. More than that, we've all had the issue, it's a long dinner, we've been drinking, and now we have to do math to determine this person's wages. That's just not a good system. Moreover, we've seen kind of a move to the future in New York, LA, Chicago. A lot of fine restaurants are just throwing out the tip, and it's worked very well for them financially and for their customer experience. Moreover, it's not fair for the server. I mean, let's say you're pouring a $400 bottle of wine or a $40 bottle of wine. You get paid 10 times as much for the same amount of work. That just doesn't make sense. And so I'm opposed to tipping.
All right, thank you, Charles. Those are some great points. Next is Brianna. The exact same question. From your personal experience, why do you or do you not like tips?
So like Tina said, I'm Brianna Moore, and I'm a current waitress at Olive Garden. And I am for tipping. And the reason I'm for tipping is because if I do more work or perform to a better standard than a fellow server, I think I deserve to be paid accordingly instead of receive the same hourly wage. And an article from Yahoo Finance, it says, offering hourly pay in lieu of tips takes the hustle out of the job. You'll get paid the same whether you serve 1 customer or 50, and whether your service is great or terrible. So I think by banning tips, you are taking the opportunity away from the server to give great service, work for more tips, and even have more tables through turnover. And that is why I like tips.
Thank you, Brianna. Nico, same question from your personal experience. Why do you or do you not like tips?
Well, as you said, I'm Nico Escalante. I've worked in a few businesses or food industries. I've worked at Bangers, I've worked at Fuddruckers, so I got the gist of it. And I just don't like how a server's salary can be given to the customer. Like, they're in charge of paying the salary. The business is where the server is employed, so they should give the salary. It's not illegal not to tip, and a server legally can bring in $2.13 an hour. That's the legal, that's the minimum wage for servers, and so I don't believe that's fair. And then on top of that, there's always going to be jerks and cheapos who just don't tip because they don't believe in it or they don't have the money. And any generous tip isn't going to make up for that for the servers. So I just don't believe that a server should have to rely on the customer to get its money. And that's why I don't like tips.
Some good points, thank you. Our next question is going to be, what are the results and consequences of tips? If you could, Charles.
Well, the results of tipping have been well studied, and read The Guardian it shows that it means much more inconsistent pay. It leads to battling for certain shifts, like say during the weekend, during drinking hours. It also makes a pay disparity between the people in the kitchen who are cooking the actual food and the people in the front who just take a cut off of everything. There's also some issues reporting income to the government. Tips often are not reported, which means we're kind of subsidizing the servers, tipping them and then subsidizing them. Not only that, but it leads to waiters trying to move tables, trying to get you out as quick as they can, and it leads to them trying to sell you, oh no, the chicken's no good, but the scallops, it's like they're just trying to have a big check so they can make more money off of that. You know, and it's just not as good for your experience, and overall it's just a really unusual practice.
Thank you, Charles. Brianna, same question. What are the results and consequences of tips?
So I think that tips results in better service and an overall better dining experience. The Bloomberg View says that research shows servers who draw smiley faces on their checks actually receive more tips. And you're probably thinking like, okay, it's a smiley face, that doesn't make sense. Well, the people are tipping because they like to pay another human being with whom they've made a good personal relationship with, which is what the smiley face represents. And so my argument is that the economists have completely forgotten about the personal relationships that actually drive the economy itself.
Great response, thank you. Next is Nico. Same question, what are the results and consequences of tips?
To touch more on to what my colleague was saying, sometimes the servers will have upselling, and that's something that a customer shouldn't have to deal with. They shouldn't have to be guided towards buying an item just because that it costs more, and in the end they can get more money out of it. But then Michael Lynn, a professor at Cornell University who's pretty much based his career on the art of tipping, had found out that actually only 2% of tip variation was because of quality service. So a server may work hard and try to give you quality service, but in the end it only accounts for 2% of tip variation. Most people know how they're going to tip going into it, and that's how they're going to tip. So that's the results.
All right, that brings us to our last question. Charles, what are the possible alternatives to having tips?
Well, as I said, we've been starting to see this in a lot of restaurants. A very fine one in New York is owned by Daniel Hum, and he has the finest restaurant in the country. It's consistently voted. And one of the big sells is he has service that's just over the top. They're almost psychic with how good the service is, but you don't choose a tip. There's just a service fee added on top. And so there's no inconsistency for them because they're the best of the best. And what this requires is it requires good management. It requires, they all take like a 6-week training course to become the best that they can be. You know, they press the tables when you leave, they fold your napkin, they cook at the table for certain courses, and it just means slightly more expensive food, and you don't have to do math, you don't have to deal with this crazy custom, trying to ensure promptness, and I think it works very well. And so in conclusion, tipping is inconsistent, it's ineffective, and it's just tacky.
All right, thank you. That brings us to Brianna. What are the possible alternatives to having tips?
So I actually believe that there doesn't really need to be an alternative to tipping because I am pro-tipping, so I think tips are fine. Let's say that tipping is banned and it's replaced with an hourly overall wage. So me as a server would be getting the same salary as another server, despite the extra effort I might put in or not put in. So basically what that means is the restaurants will have to pay their servers more to make up for the lack of tip. The food cost will be increased, and the customers will ultimately leave unhappy because they are having the service is not going to be as good as it could be if the servers were working for a tip. So that is why I am for tips and don't think there should be an alternative.
Thanks for your input, Brianna. Nico, what are the possible alternatives to having tips?
I say we just get rid of the tips completely, except for the customer's discretion, which is what it was initially intended to be. I think we should give servers some sort of base salary that they all get when they go in, and then you give them chances to climb up the ladder and earn more money based on the quality of work. So it could be that the restaurant itself is doing some sort of tipping process between the servers. If they're showing improvement, they can earn more money that way. And like you said, food prices would rise, but it would also it would mean that you wouldn't have to worry about if you're supposed to tip in front of your friends to show that you're not a jerk, or just if someone tries to give you a side but they don't tell you that the side actually costs money. It's just the upselling thing. So I just believe tips should be gone completely. The server should focus on his job, which is now a salary job, so he's trying to work hard at it to get better. And then I believe everyone will just have a better time. I think that it's not fair that tips are on the burden of that tips are the salary of the servers and that tips are given by the customer. So that's why I don't believe tips should be around.
All right, with that, I would like to thank you as the audience members for coming out and listening to what the panelists have to say, and more importantly, I'd like to thank the panelists for taking time out of their days to come and inform us on these topics. And as a quick recap, Charles was against tipping because it creates an unnecessary and inconsistent standard for your experience. And Brianna was for tipping because it gives her an opportunity to get compensated proportionally to her efforts. And Nico was against tipping as well because he believes a person's salary shouldn't depend on someone else's arbitrary whim. At this time, I'd like to ask if there are any questions. Start on that side of the room.
Okay, so you proposed that putting in like this, like the 6-week training course at like at the Fine Restaurant in New York or whatever. Do you think that would really be effective in non-fine dining establishments, like the chains that are nationwide and have turnover rates of like crazy high turnover rates? Do you think it would be really effective to have a 6-week training course requirement to work at those type of establishments?
Okay, Charles, I think this is directed towards you, and she's pretty much asking, what is the current training that's being implemented? Does that only apply to fine dining, and would it change if it were to be implemented for other franchises? How would that affect the shift in tipping culture?
That's a really good question, and that's an example of the extreme end, just really trying to point out the heights that service can take even without arbitrary tipping. But you're right, 6-week training course would just be over the top for Applebee's. But even then, they could probably benefit from a bit more training of their staff. Everyone would probably agree if you've been. Yeah, so there should tiers of service, but it's still financially viable and good for the customer service experience if you don't have tipping, is I think the case.
Go ahead.
As a waitress, do you find it ethical to persuade a customer to order something more expensive that could be less appealing than the cheaper item just to make a higher tip?
So Brianna, she's asking about the ethics, in your opinion, behind upselling in the industry.
Well, as a waitress and a consumer, from a waitress standpoint, I think if I'm a good saleswoman and I can get you to tip me more based on that more expensive item that I just sold you, I think it's fair game. Ultimately, as a consumer, I'm not going to buy anything that I don't want to buy. So I think if I try and you take it, then I just made some more money.
All right. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so I was in the service industry a while ago, and they had a base salary for servers that was around $250 an hour. So this is directed towards Brianna, because I want to know, if you keep tipping, what should be a fair base? Because $250 or $225, it was around that. That seems like a incredibly low amount to earn an hour compared to minimum wage, especially. So if you do believe in tipping, do you think there should be a base amount so that you can make a good living even without the best tips but still good service?
To clarify, I think you're misunderstood in your premise. The federal law is if you actually come out under minimum wage in your tips, then they have to compensate you to at least that level.
Okay.
So that's what's currently in place right now.
Okay, well then, do you think there should be anything above it if, actually, that answers my question.
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead.
I just have a couple questions. I was wondering if you guys had done any research or found any surveys that actually compared if you were to raise the prices of the food and kind of made a base pay for the tip at the beginning of the meal, if you compared to whether the server would make more off of that, or if he or she would make more just off of traditional tips. I wondered if you guys have found any.
So are you talking about making a percentage off the prices on the menu, increasing those and giving that to them?
I was just saying, have you guys found like any evidence that shows like servers would actually make more money by eliminating tips, essentially?
Okay. Yeah, Charles, go ahead. The question was, would servers make more money by eliminating tips, and have you found any research behind that, not only eliminating the tips, but adjusting the prices?
I haven't seen any research. I don't think that this practice is widespread enough in this country to do good studies about it. But what I have seen is anecdotal evidence, even at really kind of mid-tier pricing levels, that your compensation will look more like, instead of $2 an hour in tips, then you'll get something $13, $14, $15 an hour in benefits kind of thing. So it's just kind of a different approach to the job and what you get paid, if you will, from what I've seen.
Yeah, go ahead if you have another.
Sorry, this is the last one. Do you think that in the mid-tier restaurants, I guess kind of like the chain restaurants, like she was saying, you worry that by raising prices, you're going to lose some business?
I'll direct this towards Nico, since he works at a national franchise. The question is, do you think by adjusting these prices that you'll lose your consumer base?
If we're going low-style restaurants, perhaps, because I know firsthand when McDonald's changed its McDouble from 99 cents to $1.29, I was no longer buying McDoubles. And so I just believe it's, I don't know. What was the question again? Sorry.
The question was, if you adjust these prices, do you think you'd lose consumer base?
Oh, yeah. Well,